Okay. Good evening. I am delighted I'm delighted to be the host tonight for Professor Dana Nelson's talk on on democracy. The talk, the President, Democracy, and Permanent War. Um, Professor Dana Nelson is the Gertrude Conaway Vanderbilt Professor of English at Vanderbilt University and a prominent progressive advocate for citizenship and democracy. She is notable for criticism in her books, such as Bad for Democracy of excessive presidential power, and for exposing a tendency by Americans to neglect basic citizenship duties while hoping the president will solve most problems. All presidentialism, this is the theory of presidentialism. Her scholarship focuses on early American literature relating to citizenship and democratic government. She's our second speaker this year, and we are absolutely delighted to be hosting her tonight. Thank you.
I'm so honored to be invited as part of this series. This seems like an absolutely wonderful set of talks and opportunities for discussions, and I'm really thrilled that Anouar has invited me to be part of this. So, the President, Democracy, and Permanent War. Can everyone hear me okay? Will you wave if you stop being able to hear me okay? All right. In the run-up to the 2004 presidential election, a Bush administration official told New York Times reporter Ronald Susskind, quote, "We're an empire now, and when we act, we create our own reality. And while you're studying that reality, we'll act again. We're history's actors, and you, all of you, will be left to study what we do," end quote. This comment was received both as the administration's assessment of the intellectual left and as a window into Bush's executive philosophy. Many believed a new president might eschew such unilateralism. But these comments draw on a deep and relatively unnoticed tradition in U.S. political history and government of aggressively expanding executive powers. This expansion has come at times through the ambitions, machinations, and moxie of individual presidents, some of them impressively gifted leaders. But it has also come through the active and passive consent of citizens, Congress, and the Supreme Court. The president has come to symbolize both our democratic process and our national power. Citizens see him simultaneously as democracy's heart and its avenging sword. That trust, trained into us from our earliest days in school, reinforced by popular culture and by media, makes us want to give the president more power, regardless of the constitutional checks and balances we also learn to treasure as school children. It's not particular presidents, then, in my argument, who are a problem for democracy, it's presidentialism. Presidentialism describes the symbolic power that works unconsciously on citizens and the institutional preeminence that office assumes within government. Though the hallmark of constitutional government is the checking function of the three branches, the fact is, when we talk about democratic government, people think of the president. Legislatures and courts are factually more likely to assist than to impede the president, but on the rare occasions when they do, these branches are often cast as interfering with the power of the president and the democratic process. Baldly put, then, presidentialism is bad for democracy. It's bad despite the particular virtues and leadership skills of some presidents. First, presidentialism works against people's civic cultivation of democratic skills. It trains us to want the president to take care of democracy for us instead of remembering that democracy, properly defined, is our job. We're the sovereigns. Presidentialism, secondly, trains people to see democracy as both being led and symbolized by a single person, a strong leader standing for strong consensus, leading us to overemphasize democracy as unity. This ideal makes people fundamentally uncomfortable with disagreement I want to say this clearly, disagreement, one of the most important motors for political freedom and agency. And it keeps us from realizing that a decently functioning disunity can provide better solutions and create an even stronger polity. And thirdly, and most importantly, presidentialism accommodates citizens to war culture. It encourages people to see democracy as a winner-take-all endeavor in world politics and in the domestic sphere. It teaches citizens to see negotiation and compromise as the weakness and not the strength of democracy. Citizens' civically trained desire to see the president as the most powerful man in the world has had the effect of allowing individual presidents steadily to increase the power of their branch, most recently in the aftermath of 9/11, when Congress gave to the executive their own branch's right to supervise war powers. And that's a constitutional power that Congress has not in fact exercised since December 8, 1941. In this sense, presidentialism is colonizing democracy for its own powers and aims, depending on citizens to keep believing that the executive's power lends us strength instead of recognizing that the truth is exactly otherwise. So tonight I'll describe how presidentialism invidiously promulgates war as a structure of democratic feeling. First, I'll examine how the military presidency has recreated democratic politics as war. And second, I'll show the traction an extraordinary theory of executive power has been able to gain within our militarized political culture. Did I just lose? I don't see, I turned it off. Actually, I think when I turn it back on, we're fine. Yeah, no panic. I like to panic, but over real things. So section 1 is the mystique of the commander-in-chief, or politics as war by other means. The framers borrowed the term commander-in-chief from a title granted to colonial governors in the 17th century. They so designated the president in Article 2, Section 2, to ensure the nation's forming military would be under civilian control. Commander-in-chief is not only a hollow title, it's a civilian title. They explicitly rejected influential theories of European legal and political philosophers like Blackstone, Montesquieu, and Locke, all of whom insisted that war powers were always an executive privilege that should be hindered neither by legislative bodies nor by law. Quite differently, those who built the United States Constitution designated the numerous powers of war exclusively for the lawmaking branch. The power to declare and to fund war, and the other associated powers you see here. Only one participant, Pierce Butler of South Carolina, who maybe or maybe not coincidentally is the author of the Fugitive Slave Clause in our Constitution, proposed giving these powers to the president. Sternly rebuked by Elderbridge Gerry of Massachusetts, who exclaimed, "I never expected to hear in a republic a motion to empower the executive alone to declare war," Butler saw his motion wither without a second. As Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story would later elaborate, quote, "War is sometimes fatal to public liberty itself by introducing a spirit of military glory which is ready to follow wherever a successful commander might lead," end quote. The delegates did agree to leave the executive the power to repel sudden attacks, wanting the president to be able, in Connecticut delegate Roger Sherman's words, to repel and not to commence war. They carefully divided the power of command from the power to decide, quote, whether a war ought to be commenced, continued, or concluded. Those are Madison's words. Despite the framers' caution, it has been through war powers that the executive branch has posed its most successful claims to expanding powers, starting with Lincoln and developing commandingly over the course of the 20th century. This is a long story. I try to tell it in my book. Tonight, I'll focus on the coordination of executive power with militarism and war since Reagan. When Reagan took office in 1981, he moved to remedy Jimmy Carter's homespun dressing down of presidential authority. One of his key innovations was to begin returning the courtesy salute to Marines standing guard for a president disembarking from Air Force or Marine One. President Reagan's memorably snappy salute impressed photographers and citizens with its bracing formality, and so few noted how it undercuts constitutionalism. Civilians traditionally do not return military salutes, and the presidential salute erodes the careful distinctions the framers built between civilian and military leadership. Reagan did, of course, serve in the Army Enlisted Reserves during World War II, a service the military symbolism of his funeral richly commemorated. Because of his bad eyesight, Reagan had not been eligible for overseas service or combat. His assignment was to Army Air Force Public Relations and the 1st Motion Picture Unit in Culver City, California. But his veteran status was simply irrelevant to his civilian responsibilities as president, something combat veteran presidents from George Washington to Gerald Ford have honored. Yet Reagan's dramatic timing was spot on for his ambitions to expand executive branch powers, and I'll say a lot more about that in the second section. Over the course of the 20th century, presidents have increasingly advertised their symbolic clout as head of state to the public to leverage their specific political agendas. Scholars call this campaigning over the heads of Congress. As approval ratings demonstrate, nowhere is this strategy more effective than in their symbolic role as commander-in-chief. The symbolic commander-in-chief is the United States superhero incarnate. As such, he provides the most satisfying embodiment of the United States' international preeminence. In this vestige or salute or costume, the president invokes the classical terms of heroic action. Reassured by the strength of our superheroic commander who makes the world safe for democracy, ordinary Americans can get along with the business of daily life, exactly the appeal made by President Bush in the aftermath of 9/11. As we found our way into indefinite war, already the longest in United States history, all citizens have to do is conduct life as though all were normal. The mystique of the commander-in-chief encourages citizens to feel secure in regular life as it exacts our ever less questioning loyalty. This mystique encourages us to experience democracy through the lens of the military, not equalitarian, but hierarchical, a command where accountability flows only upward, not downward to citizens, now reconceived not as sovereign, but as rank and file. As President Bush famously explained to Bob Woodward, quote, "I'm the commander. See, I don't need to explain." That's the interesting thing about being president. Maybe somebody needs to explain to me why they say something, but I don't feel like I owe anybody an explanation, end quote. This philosophy informed Bush administration policy, and we could see its ramifications in the National Security Agency's warrantless surveillance program, where Bush enacted his assertion that he does not owe us explanations, but feels free to listen in for hours. And those who ardently opposed Bush's executive actions have supported or stood silent in the face of Obama's identical and even more aggressive assertions of wiretapping, Twitter tracing, BlackBerry busting policies and claims of sovereign immunity, and I'll say more about that too in the second section. Presidents' declarations of commanding powers over even the most private details of our life can only seem democratically commonsensical and protective insofar as citizenship has been overtaken by the anti-democratic symbolics of the military presidency. We trust him, right? He'll only listen in when he needs to. The ease with which citizens have come to consider the president our commander-in-chief, whose decisions command automatic loyalty, signals, in historian Gary Will's phrasing, the militarization of our politics. This militarization has layers of consequences, institutional, political, and cultural, to name a few prominent ones. Let's start with institutional. The framers created the congressional branch, they called it the Democratic branch, to be what they also called first among equals. Their theory of checks and balances solicited interbranch competition as a healthy feature of government. What they did not imagine, and this is where they got it really wrong, was that the president, yeah, I said it, the framers got it wrong. What they didn't imagine was that the presidency would be able to consolidate powers that would make Congress symbolically and institutionally the weakest branch. With the apparently irresistible mystique of the commander-in-chief, presidents' recourse to an expanding repertoire of unilateral powers has grown over the 20th century. As their powers rise, congressional power and its public standing declines. We typically imagine the branches to be operating on a level playing field, but actually they don't. Factually, there's a radical imbalance in each branch's incentives for an ability to protect institutional interest. As a single actor, the president represents the whole electorate. Congressmen and senators are accountable to districts and states. When the president wants to shift the status quo by taking unilateral actions of his own, whether or not that authority is clearly established in law, he can simply do it. And his actions inevitably enhance executive branch power. Congress has no such ability, and moreover, it's disinclined to act in ways that protect the larger institution. Instead, repeatedly, legislators will compromise branch power to advantage their state and districts and their chances at re-election. Public trust in and approval for Congress has declined steadily since the 1960s. While voters tend to see the president as making noble sacrifices on behalf of the nation, we're always so sensitive to his graying on the job. Political scientists John Hibbing and Elizabeth Thies Morse have found that people tend to see members of Congress as greedy, self-interested, and deceptive. Though the public seldom knows much about what's actually going on in Congress, we steadily contrast the president's decisiveness to Congress's partisan squabbling. And so Congress usually supports unilateral executive maneuvers, even though it costs their branches power. Tracking such showdowns over nearly a 30-year period, William Howells documents that, quote, Congress appears nothing short of eager to back up the president when he exercises unilateral powers. It plays well with the voters back home. So the more power Congress gives to the president, the harder it is to get it back, and the weaker and sillier they look for trying. Remember the 2007 impasse over troop withdrawal from Iraq and the rejoinder of the Bush administration, as Berkeley law professor and former Office of Legal Counsel's John Yoo evocatively summarized, quote, it would be Congress's power of the purse that would control the executive sword, end quote. And so is their bitter pill. The more power Congress gives over the president, the more symbolically macho he looks, what with that executive sword, and the more feminine. I mean, seriously, I know this is a great purse, but powerful? Congress looks when they try to oppose him in the name of constitutional balance. The subject of mock politics brings us to a second layer of consequences for our political culture. A recent book, The Art of Political War, redescribes democratic politics not as deliberation and persuasion, but as raw power maneuvers in a zero-sum game. This game's principles reverse to arresting effect the truism that war is politics by other means. David Horowitz offers a dictum for the new century, quote, politics is war conducted by other means. In political warfare, you do not fight just to prevail in an argument, but to destroy the enemy's fighting ability, end quote. I'm sorry, I have a slide for that. There you go. Sidestepping our new president's best attempts, U.S. political culture has seemingly accepted this truism as inescapable, if not necessarily desirable. Militarization redefines democratic practice in aggressively anti-democratic ways. Ideally, democracy is a system that thrives on and benefits from disagreement. It encourages a government where citizens working together find plus-sum solutions out of their ongoing differences to the benefit of political, social, and economic commonweal. Quite differently, mocked politic assumes there are only two positions in the game, winning and losing. It imagines a limited supply of democratic good that should be monopolized by its victors. This is a war that degrades democracy and its putative winners alike. The militarization of our democratic politics fosters a Manichaean worldview. You're either with us or against us, on the side of the good or on the axis of evil. It's easy to attribute these reductive and vicious characterizations to the other side, but both right and left thinkers have become infected with knee-jerk habits. Shouting head television and radio thrives on demonization, as well as a book industry that produces such titles as "If Democrats Had Any Brains, They'd Be Republicans," or "Idiot America, How Stupidity Became a Virtue." These actors overdraw political difference, insisting that your hero is my villain, which helps explain opinion polls that, for instance, at the end of September, tracked Obama's approval rating at 11% among Republicans and 77% among Democrats. And I want to say, those splits are completely commensurate with the Bush-year splits. They're just flip-flopped. The exaggerated and irremediable differences painted by demonology feeds a climate of political and social fear. Oops, I'm sorry, this one. Activating what political scientists have described as an authoritarian dynamic. Recent research shows that the effect of an authoritarian disposition on partisanship has increased markedly in the last 3 decades. My Vanderbilt colleague Mark Hetherington and his co-researcher Jonathan Wheeler's study draws on 4 questions introduced in the 1992 National Election Study, which probes for 2 of 3 key authoritarian attitudes: submission and conventionalism. The third is aggression. Hetherington and Wheeler, like fellow political scientist Bob Altemeyer, are interested to show how authoritarianism's effect on current expressions of conservative partisanship. Others caution that it's important to distinguish between the authoritarianism that is situationally manifested by those predisposed for whatever reason toward authoritarianism, and the only apparent authoritarianism of some kinds of conservatism. But within this debate is a growing consensus that exaggerated fear-mongering about corrupt leadership summon authoritarian political behaviors into the scene. And I just have this slide to make it clear that this works in both directions. And I'll talk about that more in a minute too. As touted Senate strategies like the nuclear option suggest, key democratic political skills for consociation and deliberation are declining in government. They're declining in our political culture too. Shouting head media has encouraged citizens who do want to talk politics to seek conversations amongst those with whom they believe they'll find agreement. But groups of like-minded people are highly susceptible to group polarization, a phenomenon Cass Sunstein describes at length in his book, Why Societies Need Dissent. In settings where groups share basic leanings or opinions, deliberation tends to radicalize, not moderate, the opinion of the group, and individuals within it, polarizing rather than moderating opinion. Democratic deliberation needs civil injections of diverse opinions, different expertises, and diverging institutions that support dissent. But politics as war strangles our ability to imagine a richer, more active, and productively dissensual democratic community. We can't say that the mystique of the commander-in-chief causes all of these ills, but we can say his macho symbolic presence boosts them. Finally, politics as war spills over into our daily lives. It has spawned culture wars and what sociolinguist Deborah Tannen calls argument culture, an antagonistic manner that assumes all difference to be oppositional. Argument culture encourages citizens to approach every subject as though it were war, producing slash-and-burn argumentative styles and a winner-take-all attitude toward discussion that can inspire irrelevance and even dishonesty in routine interaction. Some people relish argument, that much is clear, but those who have intelligent qualifications to contribute to debates and yet dread the war of words withdraw, and with them go vital, enriching insights. These layers of institutional, political, and social consequences to our Civil War culture are mutually reinforcing. Their downward spiral pulls us further away from being able to revitalize or even to imagine a functioning process of democratic citizen self-governance. The deeper we go, the farther we are away from being able to remember that democratic power is our power. It's what we delegate to the president and not the other way around. So section 2, the unitary executive in the state of permanent war. In this context, the one I've just been describing, an extraordinary theory of executive power has quietly ascended, one that explicitly overturns democratic power, our power, in the name of democracy. In the second section, I map the theory's invention under Reagan, the steroidal boost it enjoyed during Bush's years in office, and its ongoing support from our current president. In ways that were simply unprecedented, Ronald Reagan moved from early in his administration to take wide-reaching control of the executive branch. Reagan administration officials, in coordination with the Heritage Foundation and Federalist Society lawyers, began elaborating a broad new model of presidential power, the unitary executive, which aimed to rein in the regulatory state and entitlement spending, to lower taxes, and to win the Cold War by boosting defense spending. Drawing on a model for unitary corporate leadership, where the CEO also serves as the chair of the board, and advocates for this controversially insist that unitary corporations outperform those with divided board and company leadership. And the controversy is really kind of between the United States and the rest of the world. The unitary executive model was an aggressive brief for strong and undivided presidential control of the executive branch, expanded unilateral powers, and avowedly adversarial relations with Congress. Counselor to the President and later Attorney General Edmund Meese began voicing publicly, usually to great outrage back then, some basic tenets of this new theory. Here's one that's become uncontroversial. He insisted, for instance, that the president had the power of non-acquiescence to Supreme Court decisions, that the president had a right co-equal with the other three branches both to interpret and decide on constitutionality, and that consequently the administration had the right to disregard laws. That was controversial back then. Despite loud protests against particular manifestations, there was little formal register of unitary executive theory per se during Reagan's presidency, as members of his administration and conservative legal professionals worked to provide it with constitutional cover. There have been thousands of pages of this kind of cover published, and as an historian, I can tell you, I really have nothing but contempt for it. It's been published largely in law reviews and journals, and as far as I can see, there are no historians on the boards of those journals, or they never would have hit print. Drawing deceptively on convention debates about whether the presidency should be limited to one person, the framers' term for this was unitary, or should involve three people, one from each national region, their term for this was plural. Federalist Society legal scholars like Stephen Calabrese and Christopher Yu have insisted that the framers intended the adoption of their late 20th century corporate model of hierarchical executive power from the nation's very beginning. Rejecting Madisonian models for branch collaboration, scholars and policymakers supporting the Unitarian ideal resurrected the rejected ideas of pro-monarchist Alexander Hamilton, foregrounding his advocacy for giving kingly powers like prerogative to the president, to suggest, again deceptively, that all the framers endorsed prerogative powers as a way to ensure executive energy. This preemptive model of presidential powers was charged with growing contempt from the business community for Congress's supposed inefficiency and for the way it roadblocks leadership, what has historically been known as checking and balancing. Repudiating the constitutional model of separated branches with shared powers, this model argued, for instance, that Congress had no right to create independent administrative agencies because they exercise executive power outside the control of the president. Operating on the theory's principle that presidents usually get to keep the powers they seize, political scientist Ryan Barrylow calls this venture constitutionalism, which is a term I love. Reagan used executive orders to create policy he couldn't move through Congress on family, intergovernmental reviews of programs, and eminent domain. And as subsequent congressional hearings would reveal, Reagan also secretly used national security directives, which historically have been aimed at foreign relations, to accomplish domestic aims. As political scientist Philip Cooper summarizes from a General Accounting Office study, quote, there were as many Reagan orders that had a domestic impact as there were with a military impact, and even more than with a foreign policy impact, end quote. Reagan expanded the use and aims of presidential signing statements. As many have observed, the use of signing statements has escalated radically since the Nixon era. Christopher Kelly documents a total of 994 from Washington to LBJ, George Washington to LBJ, 1,103 from Nixon to Clinton. The trend began to look exponential. During his presidency, George W. Bush issued signing statements challenging over 1,100 provisions of federal law. Obama, who as a candidate promised not to use them, has at least slowed down this trend to date, issuing challenges to 19 provisions of laws passed by Congress, a slowdown which actually may have more to do with a pretty concerted congressional pushback against the use of signing statements than with his own decisions. Under the unitary executive theory, presidents now act as though these signing statements have the force of law, that they're not simply commentaries on laws they're signing into effect, but that they actually reshape the law that's been handed to them by Congress. And in effect nullify key provisions of legislation and exercise what the Supreme Court has explicitly disallowed, which is a line item veto. The practice became controversial enough in 2006 that the American Bar Association denounced it as presenting, quote, grave harm to the separation of powers doctrine and the system of checks and balances that have sustained our democracy for more than 200 years. Reagan's presidency profoundly reoriented theories about presidential power. We went from having persuasive presidents, which was a long theory that it was the president's job to persuade Congress, to having something altogether different after Reagan. Every president since has worked to uphold and to grow these powers. And I have a lot to say about that in my book, including about Clinton. But I want to concentrate here on the unitary executive's most outspoken proponent. Republican Party nominee George W. Bush was heralded by the corporate community in the run-up to the 2000 election as the nation's first MBA president. With one of the most prestigious business school degrees in the United States, Bush's family, education, and career pedigree promised to continue the project of transitioning the political into the corporate state. Corporate America would not be disappointed. Unitarians were similarly hopeful that the president's CEO style would deliver for executive power. But given Bush's platform as a compassionate conservative and the tumultuous circumstances of the court-blocked Florida recount by which he came into office, analysts predicted his early presidential demeanor would be conciliatory, figuring he would need to build credibility on the job and govern from the middle. They were famously wrong. He began with a salvo of executive orders, including the creation of a White House Office of Faith-Based and Community Initiatives, the reclassification of presidential materials that had previously been made publicly accessible, altering scholars as well as the public's access to presidential records, and deepening the realm of presidential privilege beyond the immediacy of the president's years in office. And finally, reversals of Clinton policies on the environment, labor, and health. Thus, many observers were surprised by the Bush administration's defense of Clinton's late-term executive orders that set aside thousands of acres for national monuments. But Solicitor General Ted Olson's arguments before the Supreme Court, suggesting the court had no standing whatsoever to challenge the president's orders, beaconed the Bush administration's commitment to a beefed-up unitary executive. The attack of terrorist radicals on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon in September 2001 authorized President Bush to take on the mantle of Commander-in-Chief. Creating the Department of Homeland Security by executive order, Bush began pushing both in public and in secret for vast expansions of executive powers through the Patriot Act, through national security directives, and through military orders. The Bush Doctrine depended heavily not just on U.S. unilateralist preemption in the so-called War on Terror, but specifically on presidential unilateralism. As political scientist Michael Cairo details, the Bush Doctrine's, quote, entire strategy is based on the presumption that the president can and must act to prevent future attacks on the United States or U.S. interests. It denies the necessity for congressional action of any kind in the use of force, end quote. Other Unitarians were willing to go even further. Harvard law professor Harvey Mansfield argued in a May 2007 Wall Street Journal editorial that the president should not only not be subordinate in any way to Congress, he should also be above the rule of law. Making the president follow the law unnecessarily weakens the executive, and Mansfield dramatically concluded a weakened executive leads inevitably to a failing nation. Indeed, as the NSA warrantless wiretapping controversy revealed, President Bush had not considered himself bound by the rule of law any more than his advisors had found him to be bound by international war rules, treaties, or Geneva Conventions in deciding the method for dealing with foreign combatants or U.S. citizens captured in the so-called War on Terror. The Bush administration pushed the theory of the unitary executive toward its logical conclusion. Earlier debates about the theory relied on an at least apparently democracy-friendly theory of branch equality. Each branch has separate and equal powers. The president has an equal right to interpret and decide on the Constitution, and Unitarians could thus claim they were simply working to make inter-branch relations more fairly competitive. But these claims to democratic equality for the president's power could hardly restrain the unitary executive's mock politic aims for branch supremacy. The Bush administration held that its every action, with both regard to foreign and domestic policy concerning security, was covered by the mantle of Bush's uncheckable privilege as commander-in-chief, powers which came to him, his advisors asserted, both through Constitution's Article 2 and through the 2001 congressional authorization for the use of military force. You energetically advocated for the legality as well as the necessity of these unchecked powers, and in a 2002 Chicago Law Review article, he mapped an explicitly monarchical genealogy for presidential war powers. You may think we had a revolution to overthrow the power of the king. Drawing on Lockean theories of the king's executive powers, you insist that while the framers may, quote, have altered other plenary powers of the king, such as treaties and appointments, they nevertheless meant to give all other unenumerated executive powers to the president, end quote. In other words, the very fact that the framers did not say they were giving monarchical powers to the president in the text of the Constitution is for you good enough evidence they intended for him to have them. Now, identifying these claims as laughably bad history and horrifying logic is simple enough, but we should wonder why Unitarians are willing publicly to argue for granting a king's power to a democratically elected president. Are Americans really hungry for a king? Or maybe unitary executive proponents are just betting we've become so enamored of the idea that our president should really have enough power, we might be willing passively to acquiesce to the idea that the most powerful man in the world should really get to have the powers of a king. There's my laugh line. Some reject alarmism, arguing that, it's so much fun going through banks of presidential pictures. I could do it forever. I have such a huge collection. Some reject alarmism, arguing that Bush's overreaching set back the march of the unitary executive, like journalist Jeffrey Rosen, who concludes, quote, Bush's extremism may have ultimately weakened the executive powers in the same way Clinton did when the Supreme Court rejected his sweeping assertions of executive privilege in the Monica Lewinsky investigation. By taking implausibly aggressive positions before the Supreme Court, both presidents precipitated a judicial backlash, end quote. But Rosen's conclusion ignores his own cogent framing elsewhere of the differences between the Rehnquist and the Roberts courts, and of key changes in political climate. The court's older conservatives came of age in an era that was skeptical of New Deal presidential excess. Its new conservative jurists, like Roberts and Alito, were educated in a period when conservatives began to see the executive as the only force that could wrest their ideals from the machinations of big government Democrats, liberal courts, and a sprawling federal bureaucracy. This generation of conservative jurists takes the executive branch's hostility toward Congress as credo. It is this ingrained hostility to democratic governance that leads Justice Department lawyers advising both Presidents Bush and Obama to argue the president has the same powers as the British monarch to suspend laws passed by Congress. These advisors have built onto the right granted to presidents since Youngstown Sheet and Tube v. Sawyer in 1952 to act unilaterally in the face of congressional silence on an issue, a new level of entitlement altogether, concluding that the president has the right to act unilaterally even when clearly opposed by Congress and law. This new arrogant assertion of executive supremacy is what Professor Mansfield offers in his case for the strong executive, and that's that 2007 Wall Street Journal editorial. You should read it. It made no register on, people did not protest this, so let me give you reasons to protest. There he redescribes our constitutional government in new terms altogether, insisting the essential checking contest lies not between the three branches, but between, quote, the strong executive and its adversary, the law. Our Constitution, according to Mansfield, provides for one-man rule. That's his term. Insofar as the Federalist proponents designated the president as the government's source of energy. Hamilton, Madison, and Jay say that in the Federalist Papers. The fact that this language is not in the legal document of the Constitution does not trouble Mansfield. This is a war on democracy, the sovereignty of the people who agree that we will govern ourselves together under the law in the name of democracy, because we all vote for the president, right? So that means he gets to be the wisdom that leads us. And its success depends on citizens embracing the idea that our president should get to win every war. This battle's success depends on, in other words, war as a state of democratic feeling. As a candidate, Obama vehemently promised to restore the executive to the rule of law, to, quote, close Guantanamo, restore habeas corpus, to say no to rendition and warrantless wiretapping. Go ahead, cry over that list. He urged that democracy was not war, neither abroad nor at home. But in office, while working for bipartisan legislation in Congress, Obama has simultaneously, though far more quietly, cultivated the very unilateralism he excoriated Bush for wielding, inventing a new executive tool, sovereign immunity, that one-ups the state secrets claimed by the Bush administration, asserting the United States government is free to intercept citizen communication of any type, even illegally, and that citizens who find out that they've been illegally intercepted are barred from suing government unless they can prove that government officials willfully disclose this information to the public. Go ahead and try to prove that. More breathtaking is his administration's response to Nasser al-Awlaki's lawsuit, asking the court to enjoin our president from ordering the assassination of his son, a United States citizen, with no due process. The Department of Justice's Saturday midnight filing stipulated that the president has the right to sentence citizens to death without charges, without due process, and that his decisions about whom to kill and why they should be killed are state secrets, and therefore unadjudicable by any court. Obama is asserting, in other words, precisely the checking contest that Mansfield poses between the executive and the rule of law. This one I love. This is a George H.W. Bush White House laureate, but he's one of the most vocal proponents of expanding executive powers, and I think if you can make him sick, that's saying something. When I began working on this project in the late 1990s, I aimed at reorienting the ideas and democratic habits of people who were unhappy with the offerings of current presidents and presidential candidates. I wanted to argue we might have a political system we could find more satisfaction in if we became more invested in local democracy, and I hope we'll talk about that in Q&A. The messy, often time-consuming, not always immediately rewarding work of face-to-face self-governing. It was a kind of puckish endeavor, asking my fellow citizens to think about the democratic project, informally and formally, as something wider and deeper than voting for the president every 4 years and then watching the news and complaining every minute in between. But the clearer tendencies of the unitary executive model for the presidency have added an alarmist aspect to my appeal. Now it's not so much a matter of simply recreating democratic practice as it is of losing its possibility from formal governance altogether. Rosen notes that, quote, conservatives are reaping the consequences of the Leviathan state they once warned against. Once executive power is viewed as absolute, centralized, and indivisible, it tends inevitably to grow, end quote. But the problems I've been outlining here today have not been remedied nor hardly criticized by a democratically controlled government. No president has or ever will consent to giving up the powers accumulated under the unitary executive, is my modest bet. Every president believes he needs such powers and more to accomplish his mandate and protect his legacy. This threat to democratic government of the people, by the people, for the people, will not likely be remedied by any person we elect to Oval Office. So the real question is what we, the sovereign people, do in the face of this threat to our democracy, which is actually a really good place for discussion to begin. So I'm done. Let's start talking. Love to entertain questions and conversation. Sir? Oh, we're gonna Phil Donahue it. Could you tell me your name?
My name's Dan Lakeman.
Dan?
Yeah. How and when did executive orders become, my understanding is that they were originally developed so that the chief executive, could put into place certain administrative things so that his branch could function properly, geared toward his cabinet.
Right.
How and when did these executive orders become legislative?
Yeah. That's a good question, and it's a slowly and long developing story. It starts with Lincoln. It expands in the 20th century. There was a wonderful Supreme Court ruling in 1936 where Justice Story pronounced the president the sole organ of government in foreign relations. And that ruling, and it oddly was a ruling on a case that had nothing to do with these questions, but Story was a big advocate for executive powers, and so he snuck that into a ruling, and then it became the platform on which the president was able then to start acting unilaterally without pushback on foreign relations, and it's just been growing and growing ever since. And as I say, we're so passive about it. You know, we love the idea that the president is decisive and strong. And
in effect, it obviates the Congress.
It obviates.
It essentially makes the Congress worthless if the president can go ahead and make the laws with the executive order and also use the signing statements.
That's right.
Yeah.
So it is more and more creating one-man rule, and it's more and more making Congress look like a little toe, a kind of atavistic appendage that, you know, just it's annoying. It gets broken all the time. It gets in the way and messes up our balance. But this is another thing the framers didn't anticipate. They left Section 2 deliberately vague, and many scholars speculate that's because they knew they wanted George Washington to be president, and they just kind of trusted him. but it didn't leave us any clear legacy for, how that office would develop over time. And presidents have used the vagueness of Section 2 from George Washington forward to push and push and push for more power.
Thank you, and thank you for your lecture.
Thank you, Dave. Who's next?
Hi, I just wanted to thank you, first of all,
Whitney, right?
yes,
Thanks.
Professor Nelson, for coming to speak to us about this topic. And I do have a question. I definitely agree with your point that Americans have become increasingly more complacent, almost to the point of ignorance, with each passing generation, with matters concerning democracy. And I do think, though, that not only is the executive branch to blame, but also I see even the legislative branch as equally to blame. You're probably familiar with the term of the Iron Triangle, which includes the executive office, the congressional committee, and a corporation. And it's manifested itself in the past in terms of the military-industrial complex or the Wall Street bailout of 2008. And I really see it as creating an impetus and the democratic process of the people. And I wanted to know your opinion, or if you see any way to overcome that kind of ironclad wall that the people face, because it's definitely way bigger than you and me.
Yeah. Well, Matthew Crenshaw and Benjamin Ginsberg have a wonderful book called Downsizing Democracy. And one of the things they trace in that book is that, immediately after the invention of democracy, nation states began working for ways to minimize the input of the people. And, with the changes in law that have happened since the 1970s and the growth of lobbies, and especially the corporate lobby, it's harder and harder for regular citizens to figure out how to have a meaningful input into democracy. There are some historians, Contra Gordon Wood, who actually argue that this was structured into the Constitution, and equally influential historian Woody Holton has argued that the Constitution functions like an invisible fence. It promises democracy. How many of you have dogs and invisible fences? So it's an electronic barrier. It doesn't look like a fence, but dogs get zapped if they try to cross it, right? And whether or not that analogy is, as legitimate in the 1790s as it is now, certainly it's really hard for people to figure out how to have input into daily models of governing. So I talk about this in two directions in the last chapter of my book, where I present, in the main, a lot of other people's really good ideas about how we take back democratic power. One is formally. There's a terrific book by Kevin O'Leary called Saving Democracy, where he actually proposes that for each congressional district, we create a council of 100 citizens. And he has two models for this plan, right? In the first model, the citizens would just be advisory to their congressperson. So it would be a place where you could actually have deliberated public opinion, as opposed to the kind of knee-jerk public opinion sampling when they call you up and ask you which cookie tastes better, right? The chocolate one or the peanut butter one. It would give citizens a chance to really think through things together in their own district, and then have that represent public opinion to their congressperson. But in the more interesting model, the one I like, these councils would actually become a fourth branch, and they would have the right to propose legislation and to veto legislation. And the interesting thing about that is that it puts federal democracy so much closer to the average citizen. He actually proposes you could be elected by lot, right? Sort of like jury selection. You'd get a 3-year term on your congressman's council. And I love that model, frankly, but some people think I'm crazy for that. I think running 100 elections every 3 years would drive everybody bananas. So I just say, call us up for duty. Most of us don't meet our congressional representatives, but you'd be really likely to know a few of those 100 people, and you'd be likely to have a chance to serve yourself. So that would be one way we could play games with the game of representative democratic government, to involve citizens more actively in ways that, early framers like Thomas Jefferson was really trying to build enthusiasm for in the early nation. But the other way is to remember that democratic, how to say, our federal government is not democracy, It's a government built of institutions that were designed to support democracy. We don't for a minute, I say this in my book, and it's actually stolen from Doug Lummis, who I think is a wonderful thinker on this subject. We never for a minute imagine that peace treaties are the same as peace. So why do we think that government is the same as democracy? Democracy is much bigger than any government structure we will ever build. Democracy is a spirit, an energy, an activity that we have to nurture amongst ourselves. And we have to do it by committing to the hard work of dealing with our differences amongst ourselves in the home, in the workplace, on the streets, as well as in the halls of government. And so there are lots of informal ways we could actually commit to this process of revitalizing democracy that won't necessarily admittedly deal with the iron triangle problem on the face, but could really redirect some energies away from it and pose alternatives to it. I think we're an enormously inventive people, and you can see that in so many places. Not just in the United States, but all over the world on the internet. There are so many really thriving, leaderless, open systems that I have to believe that if we really started putting our shoulders to the wheel of reinventing our democratic project as a leaderless project, as one that we lead together, that we could do really amazing things. People are doing really amazing things all the time. And so figuring out how to harness that then, I think is the exciting proposition. Does that answer your question, Whitney? Great, thank you. Sir? Can you tell me your name? George, thank you.
Hi, I'm George Schumann, and I was wondering, as a corollary to the way you've masterfully laid out the evolution of the degradation of our citizen powers or rights, if the whole concept of accountability isn't really directly tied into that, there seems to be a cultural version almost, or at least a trend towards not taking personal responsibility. And, it really came to mind when you're talking about the president, the single person. It's so simple for many people to say, president will solve the problem. If it goes wrong, it's his fault or her fault, etc. And I'm wondering about your thoughts concerning that.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it goes back to something I was thinking when Whitney was asking her question and I didn't get around to saying, which is, I think a lot of this is about embracing personal accountability. And so that said, on the one hand, I think that is a strong and energizing argument. On the other hand, how to say, I want to use it as an energizing argument, but not as blame. I think our institutions, both governmental as well as cultural, have made it really easy for citizens to feel, there's a lot of news to follow every day. And if you really want to stay on top of what's happening with local government, state government, federal government, you devote a lot of time to listening to the news. And you feel really politically engaged, right? Your brain's churning, you're thinking about it really hard. And so that feels like politics. Only we're not doing democratic politics, right? We're basically spectating and forming our own opinion without engaging in the work of deliberating. So there's, there are all of these ways in which the structure has become built against us. And we're going to have to think really creatively to overcome it. There are a lot of ways in which Congress has and formal government has been built to keep citizens out. And we're going to have to think creatively to storm those walls and to redirect those energies. Congress isn't going to fix this for us any more than the president is going to fix it for us. So we really do have to embrace accountability as a joyful proposition. Really, that is the radical bequest of the American Revolution. That's what's so exciting about the revolution. Really, the people said, yes, we can. Yes, we can. And that's what's so energizing about Obama's iteration of that. Yes, we can. We can do this together. We're going to go ahead and believe in each other despite our many differences of situation and background and economic standing. We're going to believe we can do it together. That's what was so galvanizing about Obama's iteration of that on the campaign trail. It's like he forgot about us once he got into office, which was entirely predictable because that office is like, it's like a centripetal force. It pulls people in and it spits out something altogether. For every candidate who's embraced executive powers and has grown executive powers, I can find examples in their earlier career of gorgeous, articulate denunciations of the dangers of allowing presidents to govern unilaterally. So the office does that to people. But we don't have to forget what was exciting about that promise. Yes, we can. I believe we can do this. We do it in all kinds of other settings. So, you know, United States colonists staged a pretty powerful revolution against a pretty powerful force. I think we could have, what? A quiet or a loud pro-democracy revolution in the United States. That's not it's not outside the realm of possibility. And I think it can be a productive revolution. So, thank you, George. Who's next?
Hi, a quick question on what you've been talking about in these ideas of reform. Because I noticed on my BlackBerry, I have the opportunity to have an application that will let me know of everything that's being voted on in my different. So my question is, do you see, or how do you see technology assisting in changing this?
That's a great question. Tell me your name.
John Miller.
Thank you. I think political scientists and sociologists and media experts more capable than I, so I'm just borrowing their arguments, are basically arguing that it's not automatically enhancing citizen access to meaningful input. It's allowing us more venues for spectatorship. It's not producing the kind of democratic deliberation that we imagined it might 20 years ago. What it has produced is more and more intense self-enclaving. So I listened to a political scientist whose name I'm blanking, but if you look me up at Vanderbilt and email me, I'll find his name and email it to you. He's got a new book out, and he actually he has traced users using the internet, and we're completely self-enclaved on the internet. We only go to sites where we think we're going to have our political opinions reinforced. The traffic for liberals looking at conservative sites is like 1% of internet usage and vice versa. There's just almost no register of people trying to broaden their sense of factual input. So the internet is not serving as that deliberative sphere by any means, and in fact, it's radicalizing us. We're getting more and more committed to, really radical versions of our own opinion with that behavior. And the technology is broadening. It's enhancing our sense of political busyness without broadening the deliberation that I think our framers were right to try to build into government. I think they were wrong to try to teach us that only representatives could deliberate. That's my difference with them. People in the early United States were really turned on by democracy, and the framers were a little afraid of that. So they wanted the people to believe that it was in the sacred halls of government where the deliberation could best happen. And that's why Woody Holton says from the beginning it's been a little bit of an invisible fence. So, did that answer your question?
Yeah.
And you'll email me if you want the title of that book?
I will do that, sure.
Okay, great.
I did have a question, though, pertaining to what you say in your book about, well, we know that nowadays, big business puts a lot of money into elections, and often we don't have the greatest choice, and we end up with a president that then selects their own cabinet that we don't have any control over. Yeah. And you mentioned, and you have mentioned, that every president, regardless of their party, is consolidating or enhancing the presidential power that they have. And so you mentioned also in President Clinton's term his use of the system Echelon, which is another monitoring system, surveillance system. Yeah. But he also released information to large corporations to enable them to obtain and compete pretty much unfairly to get overseas contracts.
Right.
The question I have is, do you see in your work that one thing that may be happening is that as this trend continues, the only winners, is it fair to say that big business has been winning right along?
Yeah, that's what I mean when I say that supporters looked forward to George Bush continuing the project of transitioning the political into the corporate state. Corporations now, thanks to the recent Supreme Court ruling, have more purchasing voting power than regular citizens by far. And we really, our government is not at all a democracy anymore, it's an oligarchy. And it's really working for business interests and not citizen interests. And I find that a deep concern. I mean, in terms of Whitney's question, it's not just the iron triangle in form of government. It's that interplay between corporate America and world corporations and Washington power that is deeply alarming. And it makes citizens feel terribly disempowered. But if we start putting our bodies out there on the streets, there are things we can do about it. We're just really used to watching what's happening on TV and thinking really good thoughts about it, but not really getting out there and doing things. Citizens in France right now are shutting everything down, and they will get a response. And so, that's an interesting. That's another interesting recourse. I mean, we call those mobs, but you can call them citizens who are really excited about their own democratic power too. And the interesting thing about the way presidents keep building more and more power is really it's actually underplaying our respect for the presidency as well as Congress. The more power that Can you not hear me? I'm sorry. The more power they have, the more we expect them to be able to accomplish. And then the more they disappoint us and the more frustrated we get. So it actually undercuts their legacy in ways that I don't think they're fully apprehending. But the beefed up presidency is hurting the presidency these days and not just us. I care more about us, though, than I care about presidents. So anyway, thank you. Those were great questions.
My name is Cushman Anthony. And
Cushman?
Cushman, yes.
Nice to meet you.
And as you're talking, I'm remembering that I've heard some of these arguments about the unitary executive theory before over the past, say, 5 years.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to remember who I've heard speaking against that. Now, you've identified a lot of political scientists and historians, none of whom I know, who clearly are onto this and are writing out about what's wrong with all this. Are there public figures as well who have been speaking out about this? And if so, who are they?
Joe Biden was eloquent in the run-up to election. He was one of the most vocal and clear opponents to unitary executive theory. As far as I know, he hasn't said a word about it since the election. And he's actually one of the few I can think of who are speaking out against this. And, it's interesting. I had a conversation. There have been 2 other books since mine that have come out on this subject. Jean Healy, who is one of the directors of the Cato Institute, has a book arguing against the accumulation of executive power. And Peter Shane, who's a law professor at Ohio, has a book called Madison's Nightmare. And he and I we were invited to some things together. And Peter said this really smart thing to me. This was like in January of 2009. And Peter said, nobody's going to speak out on this right now because everybody's hoping to be appointed to the Obama administration. And I think that was brilliant. I think he's right. I think people got really quiet about those critiques precisely because they were trying to curry favor with Obama. And he's been really quiet on the subject since he's been elected. He and Hillary Clinton spoke out against it while they were campaigning. And then, of course, neither one of them has said anything about it since his election and her appointment as Secretary of State.
Are there any others, especially are there people in the Republican Party as well as Democrats?
No. The Republican Party really likes unitary executive theory. And they're waiting there are 4 justices who have explicitly taken stands supporting unitary executive theory: Scalia, Alito, Roberts, and Thomas. So we just need one more to actually have votes that will make it constitutional. So, you know, we don't know where Elena Kagan is on this subject. You know, we'll find out, and I hope we don't find out to our dismay. There are very few people speaking on this, which is why, I mean, Anouar and I were debating on what kind of talk I was going to do tonight. I have a much more cheerful one on how the president becomes a superhero. It makes people laugh a lot more than this one. This one's a very grumpy talk, but part of why I want to give it is that the left, which was really vocal about unitary executive theory before Obama's election, has fallen silent. And Obama, the right is celebrating his commitment. You know, however much they excoriate his domestic policies, they are thrilled with his support of unitary executive philosophy. So the left is being quiet about this, and call me histrionic, I think this is a huge danger to the ideals our country was founded on, ideals I am as a citizen proud to uphold. I'm not going to want to uphold the one-man rule that Harvey Mansfield is celebrating. And, you know, but maybe I won't have a choice by then. So thank you. That was a good question. There's a woman in the, oh, okay. First you and then the woman in the blue turning.
I'm Cynthia Forrest.
Thank you, Cynthia.
I'm curious about your notion of the mechanism or the machine in Washington that engulfs a president when they walk in the door. And what is your notion of the nature of the machine and its deep roots in the governmental system?
Yeah, well, I spend a lot of time in my book trying to, you know, a lot of presidential scholars argue that this trend didn't really start until the beginning of the 20th century. So one of the arguments I play out with historians in this book is to say, no, it actually really started with George Washington. George Washington, guided by Alexander Hamilton, was deeply invested in beginning to push on the limits of executive power. And over time, and this is where the framers just made an innocent mistake, which is that institutional problem. Congress, you know, there are hundreds of Congress people, and it's really hard to get hundreds of people to agree and act in lockstep to protect their institution. The executive symbolically, practically, is geared around that one person. And that's why I actually don't blame presidents who uphold this theory. They're doing a good job to protect their institution's interests. They're making sure that they protect the power of the office as it came to them, and they're doing their best to add power to it. So it actually structurally makes a lot of sense to me that every president goes in and gets busy protecting and growing that power. They're simply being what in our historical tradition is called a good president. It's, you know, it's just my argument that we need to stop admiring that and wake up and realize what that's doing to our revolutionary bequest. That our revolution really was a radical one. And we have every right to celebrate it as such. And we need to, you know, pick up that bequest and do something with it before we live in a nation where we can't. And we kind of do live in that nation already, as Whitney was suggesting. But it doesn't have to be that way. We don't have to keep being so passive about this. So, yeah. And, you know, I have to say, I mean, I work with a lot of activists in Nashville. There are some really terrific, you know, resourceful, visionary, indefatigable, optimistic people. And whenever I get down about, you know, my own research and the political realists who want to tell us over and over people don't really want to be involved in the daily work of self-governing, I go hang out with my friends in these various causes. There are so many people who want to be invested in that work, who are putting, you know, real, just amazing resources and sacrifices and commitment to keeping their shoulder to the grindstone of creating world change. And so we are doing it. We just need to harness it a little bit better for the purposes of what we call the democracy we say we're so proud of. We need to stop thinking that federal government is democracy. It's not. It's just an institution that may or may not be doing a very good job upholding democracy anymore. There's a woman in the blue turtleneck, and then I see you in the Argyle sweater.
Hi, my name is Mary.
Hi, Mary.
You started to touch on my question. Do you see any positive signs of pushback against this unitary power and the signing statements and so forth?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, there was a great rebuke to President Obama in July of 2009. That was when he issued the signing statement. Congress had said that the president couldn't do, that nobody in the executive branch could penalize whistleblowers. And Obama issued a signing statement saying this interferes with my power as executive, and basically made it clear that he could indeed punish whistleblowers from the executive who might be reporting legally to Congress. There are already powers that keep people from reporting illegally. So he was advocating that he had the right to punish people who had reported legally in ways that he didn't like. And Barney Frank led the Congress to a near unanimous rebuke of the president, reminding him of his own opposition to the signing statement as a senator, and pretty severely slapping him on the wrist. And then Congress, since then, almost every time he's issued a signing statement that interferes with their power, has rewritten the law in ways that go right around him. And, Peter Shane, he's a good person to follow on this. He blogs a lot. And since he's trained in law, he's actually better on these questions than I am. I just borrow from him. But he's pointed out that probably in the Supreme Court, the president will win those contests if they're challenged. But it's a really good sign that Congress is starting to push back for its own power in these contests. And really, after a long time of silence, is asserting a checking function against those executive aggrandizements of power. That's a great question. Thank you. So there's a fellow in an Argyle shirt. Can I get his question first, and then we'll go back to you? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Brandon.
Hi, Brandon.
I don't know if you can comment on this. Well, first of all, I enjoyed your lecture.
Thank you.
But in your lecture, you talk about how, especially from Reagan on, each commander-in-chief has obtained and desired more power with their position. And I was just wondering, do you think that, especially with the development of media scrutiny over political officials in the last 30 years has also increased, do you think that that has anything to do with presidents wanting more executive power sort of to prove themselves against media scrutiny?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting because, they've all been pushing for more and more secret powers, and Obama's administration in particular has been really aggressive about, they're going to be proposing new legislation. I think the last I read was in April, basically saying that communication technology will be illegal unless it allows the federal government freely to scrutinize citizen communications of every kind, right? So anything that can't be wiretapped is going to be illegal. We just got really mad when the United Arab Emirates outlawed BlackBerries. Remember, we said that's more evidence of their dictatorship mentality. This is precise, and they pushed back. They said, actually, this is in keeping with what you guys are doing in Washington. So Obama's administration has been working to have more ability to penetrate into what we're saying while erecting higher and higher walls of state secrets, right? All of the stuff we don't have to look at in government. And I think it's smart of you to notice a connection between kind of the expansion of blogosphere reporting and citizen investigative journalism and the desire of presidents to create a stronger wall of secrecy for their own actions. So you may be right. It may kind of be proportional. That's an interesting proposition. It might be a good thing to write a paper on. That seems like a smart association to me. Thanks, Brandon.
Hi, my name is Howie, and I'm just wondering if you can comment on basically about our country is kind of founded on a capitalist mode of production and way of commerce and things of that nature. Do you see a kind of direct link towards the presidential thirst for more and more executive power, as also which parallels kind of like the capitalist mode of production that we have in our country today? Yeah. And do we have to not only change the way we do government, but do we also have to change the way we do business as well? That's
a really smart question. And I think I think what we have now is a form of capitalism that is different from the kinds of capitalism that have come before. Yes, Alexander Hamilton's vision was to create the United States as a commercial republic. And a lot of what got put in place in the Constitution was kind of pro-business, right? The United States was having a hard time taking out loans. And so, you know, the elites in the United States weren't able to do both their own entrepreneurial projects and the public projects that they wanted to do without loans. So they needed to show that, you know, for instance, debtors' claims weren't going to be forgiven as they were being forgiven in many of the early state legislatures. So that is one of the reasons that those protections are written into the Constitution. But saying that is not saying that the kind of capitalism we practice now is the kind of capitalism that was being practiced then, or that the framers envisioned. For instance, corporate charters back then were a privilege, not a right, and corporations had to document that they provided a public good to be able to take out a charter, which is radically different from what we have now, where the 14th Amendment, freeing slaves, has also been used to give corporations all of the rights of individuals only into perpetuity, right? So capitalism has run in cycles, and I think we're in a particularly beefed up cycle in capitalism now too, the kind of neoliberalism that I talk about in my book, the argument that capitalism should never be checked by any governing mechanism. And there again, you know, and people part ways with me on this, but, you know, I think it's interesting to think about democracy. Certainly lots of people in the early United States were thinking that democracy was going to mean that they had a right to participate in economic decision making that would affect the Commonwealth too, which is something that the Constitution moved away from them. I think that is a debatable, I think it's worth debating that. And how to say. I always say to my students, they always get really upset. You're communist. And I say, no, I think actually if we got to vote on whether CEOs get to make 2,000 times more than their average worker, if we had a vote on that, I think average citizens would say CEOs get to make a lot more than their average workers, maybe 600 times. I've actually run votes on this. And 600 seems to be the limit, 600 times more than the average worker, but not 2,000 times more than the average worker. So, you know, I don't know how much it would, how to say. I think you're right that there's a connection between, and I say this, right, the unitary executive is a corporate model, this corporate version of the unitary executive works for, you know, no holds barred neoliberal market models. Are those models good for the people, for the Commonwealth? I think those are questions we have the right to ask. And so I would encourage citizens to debate that, knowing that many will disagree with me. Does that answer your question? Do you want to say anything about that? Well, it's funny because we actually feel like we have a right to complain about the president, but when it comes to capitalism, that's actually a little bit more hallowed ground, right? And we often don't feel that we're qualified to speak on that. And that is also an interesting difference between our moment and the early nation, when regular folks of all kinds were putting out, you know, models for how to pay back the war debt. I mean, if you go back and look at the newspapers in the early nation, it's just kind of mind-blowing. Regular farmers would say, you know, here's a scheme that would fix this. And so they were really participating in these debates in active, engaged ways. They didn't believe you had to be an expert and have 12 years of training at Harvard to weigh in. They really believed they had good ideas and that we would all listen to each other. That's what they believed.
Hi, my name's Christina Mishu.
Hi, Christine.
Hi. You mentioned in your book the idea of corporate aristocracy. And as you were just talking about with capitalism being another American ideal that people are reluctant to let go of, what do you think about the current emphasis in American culture in consumerism and accumulation, not just with wealth, but also with trivial items, just so that people can say that, you know, that they are getting things, basically. And I also see in some ways this being a direct promotion of individualism as well. You know, we say that capitalism is a way for everyone to have upward mobility and everyone to have equal opportunity. But as we can see, especially from the glass ceiling perspective, that upward mobility is not always necessarily there. There has to be a worker for that CEO to make that 2,000 times salary.
Right.
And how do you see the corporate aristocracy's mechanisms as far as the media with distraction tactics and pushing this mass consumerism as a way to keep up this promotion of democracy from the people directly?
That's a great question, and I actually think you're pretty articulate on the subject. I think I'm thinking of a whole bunch of different responses to that. And I'm trying to figure out where to start. First of all, yes, alongside the kind of growth of corporate power has been the growth of consumerism in the 80s and 90s. One of the interesting things is that most people feel that they have more agency as consumers than they do as citizens. And so we're seeing lots of interesting political movements that are posed through consumerism. I will buy sustainable products. I won't buy products made in sweatshops. And so people are actually working to use the very consumerism that I think works, as you point out, ideologically to decollectivize us, to make us think of democracy in terms of our own individual interests, rather than as a commonwealth we build together. So they're using those consumer powers to push back against that and to insist that even consumerism can be wielded to build a common good. The question you're posing goes back to the very early days of democracy. I'm writing a book now called Ugly Democracy, and it's a book that argues that we tell ourselves a very bad story about the growth of democracy. The typical story is that the framers, deliberated and they didn't necessarily think democracy was the best idea for an uneducated public, and so they built us a nice representative system within which democracy was safely able to grow, thanks to them. Actually, there was a really vibrant democratic movement in the late colonies and early nation among common folk, among people who didn't leave their archives to the Beinecke, to Harvard and Yale. So it's a little harder to track down because there aren't great extant collections of papers and letters. It's also harder to track down because the form of democracy that you're describing, liberal democracy that focuses on the individual, is the one that won out. The one they were advocating for was the one that kept using words like the commonweal. Right. So they were advocating for a much more muscular form of democratic sovereignty that was non-delegable. Like, we commonly are reminded that we give up our sovereignty on the day that we vote, right? We get it only for that moment that we decide which candidate we like. And then the governing power belongs to our representatives. They believed they always had the right to be the sovereign. So they could, if their representative was misbehaving, they could go to Philadelphia and jerk him out of the halls of Congress and say, you know what, you're not representing us. We're going to put somebody else in. And obviously the framers thought that was bad for stability. Right. It's a really interesting understanding of sovereignty, and Christian Fritz is a legal historian who describes the perdurability of that understanding of sovereignty well into the 1840s in his book, American Sovereigns. They also argued things like they were not anti-capitalist. They liked capitalism just fine. But they argued that you had to have something like economic equality to support political equality. So they weren't against a market, but they were against people monopolizing land. So they were against, for instance, George Washington was the richest man in the United States when he became president. And he was wealthy because he was a terrific land speculator. And so they argued people like George Washington really shouldn't get to monopolize thousands and thousands and thousands of acres of land, but really that the land should periodically kind of get redistributed. It should be treated as a commonwealth. a commons, like water, like air, like environmental resources. The land should be treated as something that would be used to make sure that everybody had an available livelihood so that they could participate more equally in the project of democratic self-government. And that, that word, so there are some states that are commonwealths. Massachusetts is a commonwealth, Kentucky is a commonwealth. There are a handful, but it drops out of usage early in our nation's history. And I like to keep using it because it brings up the legacy of that suppressed democratic history of thinking about the democratic project as a commons, as a civic commons that we create together and that we have to guard together. There's a terrific new book by Lewis Hyde called Common as Air. This is the guy who wrote The Gift and Trickster Rules the World. He's got a wonderful new book called Common as Air, where he goes back to the framers' legacy and resurrects that idea as a usable democratic tool for today.
I think part of the problem that we're seeing as well, though, is with the public school system, that was supposed to be a measure of equality, and it was supposed to help emphasize the democratic process in the sense that we were creating that educated public who would be able to participate in government. Right. And you're seeing a lot of civics education reduced and cut back, and history, is being reduced and cut back as they reduce the amount of social studies programs that are out there. And even in colleges today, you're seeing it with the emphasis on medicine and engineering and programs that they think will make more money as opposed to things that enrich you as a person.
Yes, so you have to help us stand up for not-for-profit thinking. Yes. And that's what a Center for Global Humanities is intrinsically about. We have to believe in and be willing as citizens to allocate tax support for. My children don't go to school, right? So I shouldn't have to pay taxes. That is such a bad Commonwealth logic. That's an anti-Commonwealth logic. Education in not-for-profit thinking is the best fund for our Commonwealth. And so, yes, you all have to help us rebuild that logic in the United States because it is really suffering some painful agonies right now, and that Looking for Superman documentary is a great witness to those agonies. Yay! There are very
few of you. And I would just ask, if this is being taped, if each of us here in this room could make a commitment to sharing the information with friends and neighbors so that we can continue the discussions in our communities. And thank you again so much.
Thank you. That was so sweet. Thank you.
I am going to see this opportunity to end this session because it's great with these great words. And thank you so much, Professor Dana. Yes, this event is being